This is the River Stour, or Stour, spelt S-T-O-U-R. It's an Anglo-Saxon word. It actually means powerful flowing water. The river here is actually controlled by floodgates now. They've slowed the flow of the water, raised the water level, which, as you can see, is why the bridges are a little bit low down. The source of the river is at a place called Lenham, which is in between Ashford and Maidstone in the centre of Kent. It starts in the hills there as freshwater springs, and it eventually reaches a sea at Pegwell-Bania Ramsgate, where it flows into the channel. It's about 35-40 miles long altogether. Very little industry or pollution. The water is very, very clean. Now, the bridge that we're approaching, this is the King's Bridge. It was actually built in two stages. I'm just about to go into the new part of the bridge now. This was built in 1769. It's actually an extension of the original bridge, the lower part here, which was actually built in 1134. The bridge was built to carry a one-way traffic of horse and cart. So widened in 1769, it was allowed then to carry a two-way traffic. The bridge in all its time is believed not to have been strengthened, and it's still capable of carrying the much heavier traffic of today. It's one of the oldest bridges in England that still carries traffic. We've left the bridge behind us now, actually going underneath the building, which I'll explain in more detail in just a moment. Now, we've just travelled underneath the East Bridge Hospital, formerly known as St Thomas's Hospital, and it was actually built in the year 1180. It was built because on Tuesday the 29th of December in the year 1170, 4 of King Henry II's soldiers murdered the Archbishop Thomas Becket. St Thomas Becket's tomb was built in the crypt of the cathedral. In later years it was moved to the nave. Pilgrims believed if they prayed there, if they had any illness, any disease, then they would be miraculously cured. Now, some of the pilgrims that came to Canterbury, they had lots of money and Canterbury prospered, but some are very poor and couldn't afford accommodation, which is why St Thomas's Hospital was built. In the year 1538, the tomb of St Thomas Becket was destroyed by Henry VIII soldiers during the Reformation. So St Thomas's Hospital was no longer needed. We didn't have any pilgrims visiting. It became known as the East Bridge Hospital. The King's Bridge was formerly called the East Bridge. It became housing, a place of hospitality for the poor people of Canterbury. It's now a retirement accommodation for the elderly. We're now approaching what I call the Greyfriars area of Canterbury. The Greyfriars were properly known as the Franciscan Friars. The order was founded in about the year 1202 by St Francis of Assisi. We called them the Greyfriars because of the colour of the habits they wore. In the year 1224, a group of 9 Franciscan friars arrived in Canterbury, sent here by St Francis of Assisi. They were great healers of the sick. Their purpose was to try and help some of these poor pilgrims visiting the tomb of St Thomas Becket in the cathedral. But the Franciscans had a vow of poverty, no money or possessions. They could barely afford accommodation. They certainly couldn't build a monastery. And originally they were housed in the Poor Priests Hospital, which is now the Heritage Museum. Sadly, that building can't be shown on this tour. We just can't get that far upriver. But underneath the bridge, which I'll speak more about in a moment, the other side of the bridge, you'll see in the centre of the river we have an island. In the centre of the river we have the island of Bynwith, spelt B-I-N-N-E-W-I-T-H. Not too sure, but I believe the word Bynwith is a Saxon word meaning green meadow. The island was originally the property of the Poor Priests Hospital, and in the year 1260 this island was given to the Franciscan friars. They were told they could build a monastery here. But it's quite a small island. It wasn't big enough for a monastery, so the Franciscans begged for more land on the bank over on my left-hand side. And in 1267, that's where the monastery was constructed. Now, sadly, on the 1st of December in 1538, the Franciscan order was abolished by Henry VIII soldiers during the Reformation. Because of the poverty, the monastery was spared. The Franciscans were forced to leave. Local peasants, it's believed, came along and took most of the stone away from the buildings to build their own houses with, so the monastery vanished. But one building does survive, which I don't know if you can quite see. It's just along the river on my left-hand side there. It's the warden's accommodation, or believed to be the warden's accommodation, built in 1267. It's certainly the oldest Franciscan building in England. It survived the Reformation because Henry VIII gave it to one of his soldiers as a reward. It became used as a private house, and so stone couldn't be removed. It still survives today. It's owned by the Dean and Chapter now, open to the public during the summer months. And what I have to do is to turn around and head in the opposite direction. The water is becoming very shallow now. It's not deep enough for us to go any further, so we'll head downriver. This is the Franciscan bridge that we're approaching. Originally it consisted of 3 stone arches. It dates back to the late 1200s. 2 of the arches collapsed sometime in the 1700s, were replaced with this one large arch that we can see now. Originally there would have been 3 small stone arches. Unfortunately, the bridges weren't built for boats. There weren't any boats on the river when they were built, so you can see they're very low. Now, as we approach the East Bridge Hospital, you can see that there are actually 2 channels to the river. There's another channel over on my left-hand side. It flows underneath the building, then the bridge, and forms entrance to a mill race, where the wheels would have been that powered the King's Mill. I'll show you the site of the King's Mill in a moment. The King's Mill was built in the year 1144 by King Stephen, and it was given to the monks of St Augustine's Abbey. They produced flour there to make bread for their own use. But in the year 1174, whilst doing penance for the death of Thomas Becket, Henry II, the king responsible for Becket's death, he recovered the mill for the crown, and he gave it to Rohesia, Thomas Becket's sister. She used the mill for the production of flour. Bread was made which was given to the starving pilgrims. The mill had many owners over the centuries. By the early 1800s it had become quite derelict and in fact was demolished. So very little of the mill survives. What does survive I'll show you in just a moment. So here on my left-hand side we have the site of the King's Mill. The larger grey stone at the bottom is the foundation stone of the original building, but above all early 1800s, mid-Georgian period. But in the old stone there's actually a groove. There would have been a groove in the stonework in the building on the other side. The stonework's been replaced there. The river was actually bordered here. Possibly there was a wheel just at the other side of the board. We certainly know that the water was then, because of the dam, forced through the mill race to give power to that mill. We have the old weaver's house on my right-hand side. Now this building dates back to about the year 1500, when it was originally built as a market hall. It's a Tudor building built during the reign of King Henry VII, the first Tudor King of England. But about the late 16 and the early 1700s, the Huguenots and Walloons, Flemish Protestant weavers, fled to England from Belgium and northern France. They were under persecution from the Roman Catholics. They converted this building, set up looms inside, and started weaving originally cheap linen, which wasn't very successful. So they adapted their trade to the weaving of silk. Now, silk weaving was very successful until the time of the Industrial Revolution, and mainly because of cheaper imports from India, China, from the Far East in general. The trade was destroyed. Now, this century, the old weaver's house has had many uses. It's actually believed it was a house of prostitution at one time. It's even been a laundry. But since just about before World War II, it's been the gift shop, coffee shop, restaurant, and the boat firm here. So many uses in its time. Along the garden on my left-hand side, we have an original Elizabethan Tudor house built during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. Can't see much of it because of the extension, and as usual they have their washing out. But one characteristic of Elizabethan Tudor houses had tiny basements, and above became larger and larger. One of the reasons was the fact that Elizabeth I invented a land tax. If your house took up a lot of land, it cost a lot of money in taxation. Elizabethan Tudors built tiny basements to pay less tax. The houses were made larger above to give them extra living accommodation. Because the top of the house would be overhanging the street, it was quite good for the disposal of the toilet, which in those days was a wooden bucket. When the bucket was full, it was taken to the top of the house, the windows were open, and the contents were tipped into the street below. In fact, there is an old English custom: if a lady and gentleman are out walking together, it's customary for the lady to walk on the inside. In Elizabethan England, the lady was then protected by the overhanging buildings. It was a man on the outside who was in danger of becoming soiled. This is a friar's bridge that we're approaching now. It looks quite modern, but it does date back to around about the early 1300s when it was built by the Dominicans, the Blackfriars. Sadly, the bridge has been reinforced and strengthened many times now. There's very little of the original stonework exists, if any at all. I'm led to believe that during World War II it was reinforced to allow the heavier military vehicles to cross. Just ahead of us we have two remaining buildings now of the Dominican monastery. I'll tell you more about them in a moment. The Dominican friars themselves, they came from Italy. The founder member, Saint Dominic, he was a Spaniard born in Barcelona. The Dominicans were highly educated and they first arrived in England at Dover, travelling through France, in the year 1227. And they headed towards Oxford because of the famous university there. On the way to Oxford, the Dominicans stayed in Canterbury for 2 or 3 days to preach, to teach. The Archbishop of the time, Stephen Langton, was so impressed, he told King Henry III. Henry III decided he wished the Dominicans to come back to Canterbury, to the religious centre of England. And they were offered a large amount of land, and over a period of time, up to the value of about £500 in gold, which was an awful lot of money in those times. The monastery consisted of 10 or 15 buildings originally. Most were destroyed during the Reformation in 1538. The two Dominican buildings that survive here now are the only two real examples of Dominican buildings in England. There are a few ruins about in Oxford and Cambridge, but complete buildings, these are believed to be the only two. The one on my left, this was possibly their refectory, built in 1237. It was where they would eat and rest. We had the visitors' accommodation built in 1315 on the other side of the river. And at about this point, there used to be a wooden bridge crossing, joining the two buildings together. The wood decayed, the bridge vanished many years ago. Both of the buildings now have separate uses. The refectory on my left is owned by the King's School, the public school situated next to the cathedral, and they're using the building as their arts and their study centre. The guest quarters on the other side of the river, they're privately owned by Canterbury Man, who allows youth charity community groups to use the building for their activities. Reached literally as far as we can go in this direction now. Just ahead of us are the floodgates controlling the water level. There is about a 6-foot drop at the other side, so we do tend to turn around here and head back again. This is the site of the Abbot's Mill. Sadly no mill survives today. The first was built by the monks of St Augustine's Abbey way back in the late 1100s. The last mill was probably just pre-Victorian. Quite a large wooden building. It was destroyed by fire on the 17th of October in 1933. The floodgates were built in 1829 to raise the water level to increase the power to the wheels. The mill race is just in the far right hand corner there.